imagination, or did Dr. Stroud say like 4 times that I'm not scholarly? A little like being like be nice. He's sweet, but he's not, you know. Yeah, he has a good personality.
So, Mike, I thought we'd start under the book's being advertised, but I thought we started the show.
Great.
And I was going to ask you, I mean, this is a story I never told before, but I think it's worth telling anyway. How did you get involved in deciding to write a sitcom on ethics?
Okay, so apologies to the folks I had lunch with today, because I don't have to repeat the story now. But I was working on the show Parks and Recreation, and that ended. Brooklyn Nine-Nine was also happening, and my bosses at NBC were very kind in telling me that I could do a show about anything that I wanted to do. Basically, they would guarantee that it would last for at least 1 season. At the time, that's a little more common even now than it was 10 years ago, but it was a rare thing. It was a rare opportunity to kind of not have to try to work through the gauntlet of network television and figure out how to crack that code. They said I could do whatever I wanted, and so I called myself a hobbyist in ethics for decades before that. It was just a subject I liked and had gotten interested in and had started reading about on my own. And I had been working on this, using that term loosely, I'd been thinking about the possibility of doing a show explicitly about ethics for a while. And the moment that, I trace it to like a number of moments, which I write about in the book. One of them was I used to drive home through heavy traffic in LA, because that's all there is in LA. And if I were in the slow-moving traffic, occasionally someone, almost always driving a Mercedes, would pull into the breakdown lane and zip past everybody, because that driver was having a thought I think we're all familiar with, which is like, oh, these rules don't apply to me. Did you not see that I drive a Mercedes? I don't have to be driving. And so I started playing this game with myself where I would say, when that happened, that person just lost 15 points. Like I was imagining that life is a video game that we don't know we're playing, and that our actions can be assigned negative or positive points. And the way I would calm myself and not like disappear into like a blackout road rage was to assign negative points to people. And so I started to think about like, well, what if that is the way that the world works? Wouldn't that be nice? And that led me to the idea that there is an afterlife where your point total is like a video game. If you are one of the top 10 scorers, you get to enter your initials into the machine, and if not, you're tortured for eternity. Then it was like, well, the fun thing about that would be if someone got in accidentally. And that was all I had at that point, was that notion. But when they said you can do anything you wanted, I thought like, well, that's an interesting idea. So I will spend some time to mull over whether or not I can turn that into something. And so I then spent a very long time just by myself. When I don't know, when I'm just thinking, which I find it hard to just stare straight ahead and think, so I play solitaire, mindlessly playing actual solitaire with actual cards. And I sat in my office at Universal for probably 3 or 4 months, just playing solitaire for hours and hours and hours a day, and then I would go, no, said something, and I would write it down, and then I would play solitaire. And after like 4 months, I had the basis for the show, and went back to them and said, well, here's my idea. You said I could do anything. You said I could do anything I wanted. And they were very amenable to the idea, to their credit. They thought it was cool, and I think it also helped that I got Kristen Bell and Ted Danson involved early, because at that point they could have been a show about literally anything. They wouldn't have cared. But that was the genesis of it. It really came from that game that I played with myself, and a couple moments in my life where I have been caught in ethical dilemmas that I didn't know how to get out of, and then went on my own to read about them and to read what people had written about ethical dilemmas, and finding the answers fascinating.
Then one of them was on the side.
Yes.
That's really interesting.
That was the other one. I'll tell the story as quickly as I can. I apologize. My wife 2005, my wife gets into a fender bender, going like 1 mile an hour. There's a police officer right nearby. By the way, the reason there's a police officer nearby is because she was rubbernecking at another accident that had happened. She prefers that I leave that part of the story out. So she just nudges this guy, and the police officer says, I don't see any damage here. They exchange numbers, they go on their way. He then sends it to claim for $836 because he said the whole fender needed to be replaced. And I kind of hit the roof a little bit. I'm very anti-car. I think cars are stupid. I think they're big, yeah. Metal boxes that move us from one place to another, and anyone who's fetishistic about his or her car it's a mindset I cannot identify with. So I was like, I'd like to look at this $836 worth of damage, and I got very close to his fender, and I shined my my phone flashlight at it, or some kind of flashlight, and I could see there was a little tiny line, like a pencil thin line, and if you strained, you could make it out. And so I said, this is absurd. I don't think this is $836 worth of damage. I basically told the guy he was wrong. Like, I told him he shouldn't care about this. And also, by the way, this was during Hurricane Katrina, and New Orleans was like underwater, and I was very worked up about that too. And I said to him, how about this? I'll send $836 to the Red Cross if you agree not to fix this tiny little thing on your bumper. And he wasn't super nice about that. But he said he would think it over. So I went back and I told my friends, I was working at the office, the show The Office at the time. And I told them about it, and they got very excited by this, and they started pledging more and more money if he would agree not to get this money. I'll chip in $100, I'll give $200, whatever. And I then started a blog, like a very early blog, and laid out the whole story and solicited donations. And within like 48 hours, I had, I think, more than $25,000 had been pledged if this guy didn't get his bumper fixed. The guy knows none of this happened. I feel triumphant. That is the word I would describe it. I felt like I was solving the world's problems. And I've never been more sure in my life that I was right about something. And I went home, and by the way, I then started to get media inquiries, like NPR and The New Yorker. I don't know how they heard about it or whatever, but all of these people started asking me, "Good morning, America." So I went home and I was telling my wife about the latest developments and going over all the things, and I suddenly read on her face like unease. And as soon as I did that, I started to feel uneasy. And she actually is the first one to say out loud, she was like, "This is bad, like this is wrong." And I was like, "You're right, but I don't know why. Like, what are we doing? Why is, how could we?" It's the hardest 180 turn I've ever made in my life, from being 100% sure that this was the right thing to do, to 100% sure that it was wrong. And I panicked. I really I don't think I clinically had a panic attack, but it felt like I was having a panic attack, and I didn't know what to do. And some voice in my head, maybe from my undergraduate days, said this is an ethics question. And so I went online on like a dial-up modem. Remember, it's 2005, like the world is very primitive, and I started reading ethical papers. I literally, I think, probably Googled like, what is ethics? And I started reading stuff. And that night I sent emails to like 3 or 4 professors who had written papers that I had read that said like, "I'm a television writer, I have a weird question for you, would you talk to me?" Every single one of them got back to me because it turns out that academic philosophers love talking about academic more than anything in the world. Like, they will drop whatever they are doing. If someone says, "I have a philosophy question for you," they'll scramble over to your house. That was the real genesis of this, was like I read about virtue ethics, and I read about Kant, and I read about Mill, and I read about Bentham, and I started to come to understand why what I was doing maybe wasn't purely a good thing. At the end of the day, I called the guy, I sent him a check, I told him the whole story, I apologized, and he said that maybe he would send some of the money to the Red Cross. thought that was nice, but I told him in the new language that I had learned that he was under no moral obligation. And that really, like, that was the beginning of my, I would call it, I shifted from being an amateur or a hobbyist into a person with an active passion for the subject. And I started, as a matter of course, reading books and papers on ethics, not all the time, but occasionally. So the idea really, I mean, that was a good 12, 11 years before the show. So that was, I think, if you want to carbon date the show to one moment, that was probably the moment.
Yeah, and here's something I was thinking about on the way over, and I never asked you. So the show is 4 seasons.
Yeah.
And you're not done reading ethics at the start of the first season.
No.
I mean, you're reading it and you're thinking about the show and thinking about what it takes to show.
Mm-hmm.
So over the course of that time, what changed for you in your ethical perspective as you're reading and trying, because you're doing two things at once, right? You're reading ethics, but you're also putting ethics into a situation.
Yeah.
So how did your ethical perspective change over those?
It changed pretty dramatically, I would say. I mean, by the time the show started, I would say I was decently well versed in probably what the UNC like philosophy 101 survey would cover, right? I had a pretty good, maybe a slightly deeper understanding of virtue ethics, of deontology, of utilitarianism, and I had also, by that point, read Tim Scanlon's book, which is somewhere between utilitarianism and deontology, and then a bunch of other stuff that sort of doesn't fit neatly into one of those categories, but I had this sort of like broad survey. But what would happen is we would be working on the show and some question would come up that we hadn't considered before that wasn't answerable through simply applying one of those theories. So for example, spoiler alert, apologies for the show, but pretty early in the show, in the second season, there's Ted Danson's character, his name's Michael, and he's a bad guy at the beginning of the show. He's an immortal being whose only purpose is to make life unpleasant for people who die. And the idea that we had for the season was that he would slowly be won over to the other side, that he would slowly sort of chip away at his understanding of humanity and ethics. And someone posed the question in the room, well, how do you get an immortal person to care, an immortal being to care about human ethics? And it turns out that someone has actually written a book about that exact subject, and that person is Todd May. The writer on the show came back the next day after that discussion, was like, there's a guy who wrote a book about this. It's called Death. And it's 100 pages long, and at that, my ears perked up. So I bought the book and read it, which actually led to one of my favorite moments from the entire run of the show, which was my wife at this point, who's also a comedy writer, was very used to large Amazon packages of books showing up at our door filled with very imposing looking volumes. She actually brought me at one point I bought a Harvard's On What Matters, which for those of you who know is 2 volumes or possibly 3 volumes, depending on how you count it. And it weighs, I don't know, 8.5 tons. And she brought that book into my office because it had just shown up, and she stared at me and just dropped it on the floor. The maximum sound that she was looking for. Anyway, the point is, I was lying in bed reading a book called Death by Todd May, which has, the cover of it is black and has a raven on the front. And I was reading the book, and she was brushing her teeth, and she walked into my room, and she saw me reading it like this, and she went, "This show's gonna ruin my life, isn't it?" No, sorry, man. Anyway, the point is, as the show went on, these questions started cropping up that weren't simply like, oh, this is a virtue ethics question, or this is how Chidi, the Kantian, would feel about this versus how Eleanor, the virtue ethicist, would think about this. They were very specific questions of ethics that applied to some corner of the show that had cropped up as a matter of course because of the storytelling, not because of the umbrella theory of ethics that we were investigating. And at that point, I mean, that's how I came to you, it's how I came to Moral particularism was another one like that, where we were searching for like the nuanced example of what something Eleanor could say to achieve a certain moment. And so, yeah, it changed mostly by just broadening and deepening in that way, but also I would say my own personal understanding, my own personal connection to ethics changed along with it as I learned more and more about this stuff.
When you say your personal connection, is that the framework of it, or you just felt more caught up in, I need to ask and answer ethical questions for my life?
More the latter. I mean, more in a sense of like, I think that if you had asked me to define my own personal sense of ethics, I think that answer would have changed over the course of the years I worked on the show. I would say that I probably went in to the beginning of the show considering myself something of a utilitarian. And by the time the show was over, I considered myself something of a virtue ethicist. And in between, there were certainly nights where I was like, Kant is right. All these other idiots are lame. Kant has the right answer. They couldn't hang with Kant, and that's why Kant is the best. Like, I was there. I never fell into Nietzsche. I don't think I avoided that trap. I certainly never fell into like Ayn Rand's trap or anything. I did ebb and flow amongst the disciplines in a personal way.
Say a little bit about what's so attractive about Aristotle. Thinking through ethics as a way of living.
So, at the end of the day, now having had a decent amount of exposure to many theories of ethics, the reason I lean Aristotle or virtue ethics is because to me, he's the most humanistic of all of the disciplines. And what I mean by that is his system of searching for means of virtue and for being pulled in one direction and then realizing you need to sort of move back in the other direction. The complaints are understandable. It's maddeningly non-scientific. It doesn't give you a playbook that you can simply pull out of your pocket when you're in an ethical dilemma and flip to page 48 and find the answer. However, to me, I find it attractive because I feel like what he's essentially saying is, look, you're going to screw up a lot. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to drift too far in one direction or the other. That's okay. That is part of the process of trying to find these means. The important thing is that when you do, you note it and you examine it and you clock it and you try to calculate the degree to which you've drifted too far in one direction or another and try to move an equal amount into the other direction so that you can get closer to that center. That's a thing, that's a sort of like understanding. He's just very compassionate, I find. He's more compassionate, certainly, than I would say Kant is. He's even more compassionate, I think, than the utilitarians are, because the utilitarians will happily ignore pain and suffering if it's outweighed by a certain amount of happiness, and that doesn't feel right to me. So I just found his sort of trial and error approach to the search for virtue to match what I felt in my own life. You know, I feel like that's the thing we're all doing all the time, is blowing it, realizing we blew it, and if you haven't read Aristotle, you just, when you blow it, you just like hide in your room and you go to sleep and you pretend, you hope that like everyone will forget the next day that you blew it. And that's the playbook for most of us, unless you've read Aristotle, in which case you're like, okay, an opportunity for me to now understand how I can be better in the future and and to like put this into context that leads me to a better outcome the next time.
So I want to switch gears, but before I do it, I don't know if I've ever told you this before, but you mentioned contacting me. So he contacts me out of the blue, right? Questions from a TV producer, and I looked you up. And
did you find out I wasn't scholarly?
I tricked you for a while. And I said to my spouse, I said, this guy doesn't know it yet, but I'm going to be on set. Yeah. And I got
you called your shot.
I did. And
that's a very Hollywood move, by the way. With no, just bold confidence without anything backing it up.
When it now happened, my spouse said, you did it. You did it. You manipulated your way. It's not very ethical.
Wow. No, wait, what was it that made you have that feeling?
Nothing. I just thought you seemed like a cool guy, and I don't want to be on set.
All right.
So anyways, I hear you've written a book.
Yes.
Right.
Thank you for bringing it up.
Yeah. That's a call. No. So tell me a bit about the transition from the show to the book. Why you have a successful show? You've done a lot of reading, right? Why pivot and do the book?
Okay, so the show ended after 4 seasons, which was our choice, just to be clear. We didn't get canceled. And I felt like the writers and the actors and the production team and I had made something that I was very proud of, because I think the degree of difficulty was an order of magnitude higher. It's very difficult to make a TV show. It's even more difficult to make one that lasts for a while and that people like. But I think that I was just very proud of the team of people for committing to this kind of crazy idea and making something that I felt legitimately was good. And I was thinking back on all of the work that had gone into it, on my part and also on the part of all of the people who worked on it. And I sort of thought, like, I just felt like I wasn't quite done. Like, there was a feeling that, like, I wasn't quite done thinking about or talking about the subject. And so a book was a natural, like a period at the end of the sentence of the work I'd been doing for the better part of 7 years at that point. And so I had this idea to sort of try to write essentially the book that I wished existed when I was beginning the process of working on the show, which is to say, I'm going to talk about all these philosophers and what they said and how they purport to make us better people, but I'm going to do it in a way that won't make you want to kill yourself, which seems to be the goal of most academic philosophers. I believe that the stated purpose of most academic philosophical writing is, I want to inflict pain on the people who read it, and I want them to suffer greatly, and somehow that will make me feel better. That's what I'm imagining they're saying when they...
You are scholarly.
There you go. So I mean, 2 things had to happen in order for me to write this book. Number 1, I needed Todd, because Todd had by that point been serving as the academic philosopher / Sherpa on the show for 3 years. And the joke in the writer's room is that we had for those of you old enough to remember this reference, we had a red phone in the writer's room, like Reagan used to have to call the Kremlin if there was like a impending nuclear disaster. And we had a red phone where someone would pitch something and I would say, like, well, that requires that we know something about Camus, like, grab you know, call Todd and have him immediately explain what the hell Camus was talking about. So the book couldn't have happened without Todd being there, and I pitched it to you, I think, as saying, like, I am going to write everything that I feel like I've learned about, and you are going to be like a sheepdog that just herds me back when I start to stray and explains to me what I'm doing wrong. Also, Todd academically, when he was a student, was an existentialist. And existentialism was the discipline in which I found the most difficult to understand. I'm not the first person to ever say that. But it was vital. I made Todd explain the differences between Sartre and Camus to me 11 times? Probably 11 times.
Yeah, but there's more to that story. Right. One thing I should say, Mike's work, right, this is your philosophy, right? I mean, we talked about different philosophical issues, but you thought the issues through, right? You came up with stuff. This wasn't you just channeling.
See, Dr. Stroud, where are you? Todd thinks I'm scholarly.
I think it's funny.
Yeah, that's true.
Right, somebody had to humor, otherwise we could try. But the story was that you were reading Camus' Myth of Sisyphus.
Oh God, this is so embarrassing. This is so embarrassing.
It's not, but it's kind of cruel in a way. And so we're discussing Myth of Sisyphus, and I'm saying, look, there's things about philosophical suicide and physical suicide. And at some point you said, where are these things? It's not in the essay. And I said, no, it's in it. It's in the essay. It's there in the essay. And it took us a while to realize that Camus' 100-page essay called The Myth of Sisyphus has a 3-page afterword called The Myth of Sisyphus. And
That's which one I had read.
And then I sent you a copy.
Yeah.
And then, like, again, right, like 15 minutes later, like,
I've never felt less scholarly in my life. He was talking about all these things of the difference between philosophical suicide and actual suicide and weird. And I was like, I've read this thing like 8 times. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. And he was like, no, it's on page 42. And I was like, there's only 4 pages. I can't fool me.
But you should talk about the structure of the book, because there's like no ethics book is structured in the way that you came up with the structure of this book.
Right. So I pitched the book. By the way, to close this loop, the other thing that had to happen for me to write the book was I needed a large amount of time, which I didn't have. And I sold the book right when the show was ending. So the last episode of the show was the end of January 2020, and I sold the book in the first week of February. And then the pandemic hit, and suddenly all of the TV production that I had to deal with in the next 9 months suddenly disappeared, and I had nothing to do but write the book, which was a weird blessing for me. There's a great short story by Borges, if any of you have ever read it, about a political prisoner who who's arrested. He's working on his masterwork, his dissident masterwork, and he's arrested, and he, at night in jail, he prays to God to give him somehow a year to finish his work. And he's going in front of the firing squad at dawn the next morning, and he's brought out in front of the firing squad, and he repeats the prayer, I think, and says, please, I need time, I need a year. And the bullet is fired and it freezes at the end of the gun. And he realizes that God has granted him a year only in his own mind to finish his work. So he writes the book in his brain as every day the bullet inches closer to him. And by the end, he's writing like the final chapter, and the bullet is pressing into the front of his head. And he finishes the last sentence in his head, and the bullet hits him and he dies. It's a beautiful story, very depressing. But it was the first thing I thought of when the pandemic hit, which is, this is so horrifying, this is so awful, and also I've been now given this weird gift of the time that it's going to take for me to actually write this thing. And it was a real salvation for me, because as we were all dealing with what happened, and my kids were so confused and scared, and we were all scared, and everybody was scared, I had this thing that I could go to every day for hours and hours and hours, and just really, it was an incredible escape. So the way that I pitched it and the way that I wrote it is that every chapter would be a question that would be posed. And I thought of this because I was like, okay, I want to sort of take people on a, there will be 3 sections. The first will be sort of laying out the basics of these theories. The second will be kind of slightly more complicated questions. And then the third part will be like the most thorny and difficult to answer questions that I think people face in the modern world. And so I was like, okay, I have to start with the simple stuff. So what's the most basic ethical question I can think of? And I settled on, should I punch my friend in the face for no reason? So that's the first chapter of the book, is should I punch my friend in the face for no reason? The answer is no. You got that, good work, you're on your way. And then over the course of the book, the questions get more and more difficult to answer until we're into some very tangled stuff, like the one I think that's the most discussed, I would say, in the time since the book has been out, has been, can you separate the art from the artist, right? What do we do about the fact that we worship certain writers or directors or musicians or famous people who are revealed to be not so great, and whose actions don't comport with our sense of what a good person does. I don't know how many of you are sports fans, but there was a story just today that the owner of the Washington Commanders football team, Daniel Snyder, who really is just a special kind of asshole. Even among sports franchise owners, he stands out, which is a difficult group to stand out to. We're talking about terrible behavior, but he's been under siege for a long time. First because he refused to change the name of his team, and then because his entire organization was revealed to be a horrifying pit of sexual harassment for every woman who worked for him, including the women who were the cheerleaders, who he would essentially auctioned off to some of his supporters and donors the chance to go to a private island and like watch them have their calendar shot, and then gave them, some of them had access to like the locker rooms where they were changing. I mean, this is a nightmare person. And just today it was revealed that he has been hiring private investigators to dig up dirt on the other NFL owners in order to basically hold this sword of Damocles over their heads to say, if you force me to sell the team, I'm taking you all down with me. And my heart goes out to any fan of that. Like, imagine you like grew up and you and your parents took you to games, and they bought you jerseys when you were a kid, and your identity is wrapped up in fandom for this franchise. And then as you grow older, you just realize, oh, this is a nightmare. These people are nightmares. Like, how do you can't just rip that out of your soul. It's not possible. Like, you can't just decide one day, I don't care about anything that happens involving this team or this franchise or anything else. And yet you just watch every day as this guy does something that is horrifying. And so I try to wrestle with that, with questions like that, in addition to, should I punch my friend in the face for no reason? And that's how the book is structured.
Right, but actually you have some very eloquent pages about your own struggle around Woody Allen, because he was so formative for you.
Yes, there are. I mean, look, we all have people like this, right? It doesn't matter what you care about in the world. For me, it's comedy writing, music, and sports. For other people, it might be fine art and philosophy, for that matter. But we all have people who matter a great deal to us and whose works are very important to us and our sense of who we are. For me, Woody Allen was one of the first people who made me want to be a comedy writer. And I grew up and all sorts of horrible things came out about him and what kind of person he is, and that made me reflect differently on his movies, many of which, if you're familiar with his work, feature 64-year-old men having affairs with 19-year-old women. Suddenly that seems a lot less charming or even artistic when you realize what kind of person he is in his real life. So yeah, I think this is a thing we all wrestle with all the time, and I don't think there's an easy answer to it. Again, spoiler alert, if you read the book, I don't answer the question. There's not like, here's what you do. Like, a lot of these questions in ethics aren't here's what to do. It's simply, what are your options? What sorts of actions seem like better or worse? And how do you maybe try to aim yourself at the ones that are better?
But, and it's also, by the way, and I mean, you know, that's a very Aristotelian thing, that
right.
is to become more sensitive to the situations, right?
Yeah.
Rather than having the grid you place over and say, here's the thing to do.
Yeah, and which is why I think despite my brief flirtation with Kant, I think I kind of could never quite get on board the idea that if you just think long enough, you'll come up with the right answer, using only your own reason. I don't think that that's possible or true. And if you do that and you come up with the right answer, and the right answer turns out to be never listen to music or look at painting or watch sports again, that's not really an answer. It's like ripping away too much of the life that you care about and identify with. I was listening to a podcast right at the end of the book. My wife and I were driving somewhere, and we listened to a podcast, and she was searching through what can we listen to, and it was like, oh, here's a thing about Gertrude Stein. And I was like, that sounds great. I don't know anything about Gertrude Stein. I vaguely know who Gertrude Stein is. I would love to spend a half an hour getting to know Gertrude Stein. So we listened to this podcast, which is wonderful. And it talks about how she was at the center of the Parisian art world, and she was friends with Picasso and Modigliani, and how she had these incredible salons at her apartment, and all these people would come over, and they would eat and drink, and Picasso would sketch something on the wall, and it was like very like, oh, what a life. And then, spoiler alert, World War II happened. And she didn't want to leave her Parisian apartment or her life. And she didn't want to, she and Alice Bitopoulos, who she was her partner at the time, had a very good life in Paris, and they didn't want to leave. And so they struck a deal with the Vichy government in France to basically keep the cops out of their apartment and let them keep all their art. And in exchange, she translated Hitler's speeches into French and helped to disseminate them throughout France. And I was listening to this, and I remember very clearly having one thought, which is, you've got to be fucking kidding me. I can't even like Gertrude Stein. Gertrude Stein is now problematic, like how, and so you just over and over again come to this conclusion, which is that there is no, if you invest your life or your emotional happiness in the works of other people, you are at the mercy of the actions of those people to such a degree that if you decide that you are never going to engage with whatever they did, if they did anything that doesn't comport with your value system, you're doomed. You're doomed to never live your life. You're doomed to never engage in the world in the way that I think leads to people living burdened and interesting lives. And so I don't think that the answer is black and white. I don't think it's like cut them out or, and certainly obviously the answer isn't ignore what they did. You can't do that either. Because then you're not showing a proper amount of empathy for the people that suffered at the hands of the people and whatever they did. So it's just gray and muddy and awful, and you just have to wrestle with it forever, and that's why Aristotle is my guy.
But we've also had long conversations about this as well, and it's not just other people, it's us, right? We're all morally complicated. One of the reasons that I think you and I like the films of Kenneth Lonergan is that there's always other sides to people. Some a moral side that you hadn't seen, an immoral side. I mean, not like we're translating Hitler in French or anything, but
well, speak for yourself. I did do that briefly.
She never published it.
That's true. Just for me. It was like a calm me down. It was like the way some people do like calm me down. Translated Hitler's speeches into French.
Every immoral philosopher has a concept that's associated.
Ah, yes, I know what you're talking
about. It's the categorical imperative. Aristotle, well, he has the golden mean, although he never said anything like golden mean. Right. Every philosopher who's achieved some level of immortality has a concept. And yours is?
Mine is moral exhaustion.
Please go
So, here's what happened. I decided that in the writing of this book, I was going to try to come up with a pithy phrase that I could claim I invented that would become my academic philosophical calling card. And so I was writing this chapter about how difficult it is to just move through the world and be faced with the number of ethical dilemmas that we are all faced with every day, and to find the strength to keep grappling with them and caring about them. And so I coined this term, which I capitalized in the book, because you got to capitalize it. You know what I mean? Like no one will know it's like a thing that matters unless you capitalize it. So it's called moral exhaustion, and it's basically the idea that like I just said, that we are all faced with these issues: what shoes to buy, what car to drive, what restaurant to eat at. We're faced with so many of these things that we have a fatigue. When people say, you say like, oh, I'm going down to the coffee shop to get some coffee, and someone says, oh, you can't go there anymore because it turns out that those beans are not fair trade. And you go, oh God, I just want some coffee. Please just let me do this. I promise I'm a good person. So I was like very excited by this. It was like, I'm going to coin this term, and it's going to be my calling card, and I'm famous. And I told Todd about it, and he was like, that already exists. And here's what it is, and he sent me all these articles, and I was like, you gotta just let me have this. I'm gonna ignore all of these people who came to this long before I did, and I'm just gonna assert, if I've learned nothing from the Donald Trump era, it's just assert that you're right. And to ignore everyone who says different. That's what I did. So there's a whole chapter about moral exhaustion where I just absolutely, with blind, unearned confidence, assert that this is my idea. And I tried to trademark it. At one point I just claimed it's trademarked. It's not trademarked. But I do think that it is a real thing. I think that it's real, and I think we all feel it, even if we maybe don't articulate that we feel it every day. I mean, imagine if you're a Washington Commanders fan and you woke up this morning and learned yet another thing about your plague franchise, and then you were shopping for a pair of jeans and you go online to look at reviews and someone's like, don't buy these jeans, they're made in a sweatshop in Vietnam. And then you were like, okay, I'll buy locally sourced vegetables. And then you read another article that says you can't, they treat the migrant workers who pick these vegetables aren't given health care. And it's like everywhere you turn, if you peek behind the curtain at any, especially in a capitalist consumer society like the one in which we live, you peek behind the curtain even a tiny bit when you make any decision, you will find an ethical dilemma that you then, if you decide that you're the person who cares about these things, you have to navigate somehow. And it's exhausting, it really is. And there's no cure for it other than to just pick yourself up and dust yourself off and plod forward.
Right, but I decided, I've been thinking about this. I decided there is a difference between moral exhaustion and what I said was the cognitive term, which is compassion fatigue.
Okay.
So compassion fatigue is an emotional thing. Right? You get worn out from
like the 9/11 nurses and doctors who had to over and over again go through this process of
Right, but moral exhaustion can be different, because moral exhaustion can be when you're trying to act in a principled way and you're getting exhausted, not emotionally, right, but morally through trying to act in a principled way.
I think that is the difference, yeah.
Right, but here's what that is. That goes better if you're a content.
All right, I'm a content.
So here's the
look who's on the stage again. Well, we have a third scholar.
Is this a good moment to go to discussion?
Yeah.
Let's thank our conversation. Thank you so much, Michael Schur and Todd May. It was wonderful to be flies on the wall for that. I'm sure people have questions, so we have time for questions and exchange. Let's start with you.
Todd's not allowed to help. What's the difference between Sartre and Camus?
Camus is a lot easier to read, because his essays are only 4 pages long. The real joy of writing that chapter was that Todd was explaining Sartre to me, because he was a Sartre scholar when he was an undergrad. Here's a quick story, here's a quick anecdote about Todd. So Todd decided that he was an existentialist. And for those of you who might not know, one of the tenets of much of French existentialism is that basically you are what you do, right? You are defined by your actions. Man exists first in the world, and then he defines himself through his actions. And so for a while, in grad school or undergrad, where were you? Undergrad. So Todd decided he was a pure existentialist, and so people would say like, hey, do you want to go see this movie? And the way he would respond is by saying, I am choosing to not go see that movie. Or like, you want to go get some coffee? I am choosing to go with you to get coffee. Like he began every sentence by saying, I am choosing to do this so that he could be in touch with his essential existentialism. And when I heard that story, and I said this in the book, Todd is married and has children, and that is amazing. He must be so, such a good conversationalist and such a sparkling wit, because if that was the way he was going through life, the idea that he would meet anyone who would go, yeah, this guy, my life partner, seemed the remotest possibility.
I did in the end choose to be a good conversation.
Fair enough.
Yes, here, the third row.
Sure. So I'm like a big fan of all of your shows, including Brooklyn Nine-Nine. But I was just wondering that, like, in light of America's contention regarding policing in the USA, what are the moral and ethical implications of writing and profiting off of a show that romanticizes police work and like police officers?
That was a huge, if you didn't hear the question was about the show Brooklyn Nine-Nine specifically. What are the moral or ethical implications of writing shows where the heroes essentially are police officers or detectives, and also profiting from making a show about those people? So the show predated what you would think of as I would call it the post-George Floyd era, right? By a fair amount. And I will happily answer this question. It should be noted, I was only actively running that show and working on that show for the first probably 2 years. So the better person to answer this question is my friend Dan Gore, with whom I created it, but I think I can speak for him in answering that. It wasn't just that moral dilemma. We actually asked ourselves that question from the beginning, because even way pre-George Floyd, there were incidents with the New York City Police Department that, I mean, this is dating back forever, that were horrifying and awful, and the response to them from within the department was a nightmare. And so we asked ourselves that question too, and we ended up where, unsurprisingly, on the side of, well, we're trying at some level to show what the good version of policing would look like. And by doing that, we were also saying, we're also going to show what the bad version of policing looks like, and we're going to try to explain what the difference is. But in addition, by the way, we had another question, which was the company that bought that show was Fox. And I am of the personal belief that there's not a single human being who's done more damage to the fabric of American democracy and probably world democracy than Rupert Murdoch. And so now, hardly a controversial take, it's probably factually provable. But so we went through that and we were like, okay, well, our show is about a black gay police captain who was denied the ability to run a precinct because of prejudice within the NYPD. And the people who work for him, the detectives who work for him, are going to be defined by his moral code, which was our moral code. And we ended up feeling, and maybe this was self-serving, that the benefits of putting on display on that network a moral code that we thought was the good one outweighed the dollars that we were throwing into Rupert Murdoch's pocket. I think it's absolutely fair to say that we were self-serving and were wrong, and that we shouldn't have done that. I don't know what we would have done if we had pitched that show or come up with that idea 5 years later. Maybe we wouldn't have. Maybe we would have said, you can't do a show about police work, especially in New York City. Doesn't matter what your intentions are, what your goals are. The act of heroizing police officers is, first of all, not anything anyone wants to see right now, but also doesn't make up for the fact that you're basically you're doing a show that's from their point of view. And I don't think the point of view of the officers and the detectives was the one that mattered, suddenly, maybe for the first time in American history. So it's a thing that they really grappled with, and Dan, I think very courageously, in the last season of the show, was like, we're running right at this. Like, they were deep into the story breaking and had written a lot of episodes when George Floyd happened, and they threw them all away and they started over, and they concocted an entire season basically taking the point of view that the problem here is calcified systemic racism from within the department. It's not easy to do that in any context. It's even harder to do it when the show by that point had 6 years of establishing a certain tone and a certain comedic style and a certain vibe. And I happily can brag about this because I had nothing to do with it. I think they did an incredible job of putting those issues on display and running right at them without losing what was essentially the same, without losing the essence of what the show was. So those questions are real, and that show in particular had them more than almost any show I can imagine working on, because suddenly that was the thing that we all decided to care about. And in the caring about it, in the national caring about it, the international caring about it, it suddenly, I think we all were like, what are we doing? This is insane. Even though our aims, I think, were righteous, and I think we're on the side of the angels, you would say, in terms of what we were trying to say about that world, we were still putting it in the center, the moral center of the show was still police detectives, and that was harder. That was very hard. And I don't envy the folks who actually had to do the work. I was sort of on the sidelines weighing in when they asked me to, but they did all the hard work and I think they did it really well.
Yes.
So obviously you're a really talented screenwriter. I'm an aspiring screenwriter and I've thought a lot about this as I've read your book, but like to what degree do you think screenwriters and I guess like artists in general need to be like philosophers when like creating their art, I guess?
The question was, to what degree do screenwriters need to be philosophers when approaching their work, right? I don't think you need to be a philosopher at all. I don't think you need to be really much of anything. If you don't want to, you know, like I don't think that, I think you can be a good screenwriter, you can come at screenwriting from a million angles. I think that being not necessarily a philosopher, but interested in things like philosophy can help. Because ultimately, screenwriting is about examining very minor nuances of the human condition. And so if you are a fan of something like philosophy or history or any other liberal art, you've spent a good amount of your time in that world, right? You've been examining character types and the shadings and the nuances of how humans are weird and what they do to each other that causes either pain or happiness. And I think that having like a reservoir of understanding about the human condition, I think is the only prerequisite. But you don't have to get that from philosophy, you can get that from any number of places. The book that I think honestly helped me be a screenwriter more than any other book we were talking about earlier is The Power Broker, the Robert Caro book about Robert Moses and the building of New York City. If none of you have ever read it, it's the greatest book ever written. It's only like 1,200 pages, so you get through it pretty easily. But it is the most incredibly detailed character study I've ever read of any human being. And it follows this incredible ascent to power and displays the ways that power corrupts people. And when the show Parks and Recreation was starting, I actually read it again. I had read it once and I read it again because it's about civic planning. And that book is the basis for like 12 different characters in that show because it's so specific and so detailed about the way that people behave in different parts of the government and why. I mean, I like philosophy. Be a philosopher, it's fun.
Actually, I could add something about that, relative to philosophy, because what we think of as philosophy now is not the way philosophy has been done always. Right? In ancient Greece, to be a philosopher was to have a reflective view of how a life should be lived and to try to live it. It wasn't an academic pursuit. And Aristotle had a view, and people who were Aristotelian, they were trying to live their lives certain ways, and Stoics were trying to live their lives certain ways. And it's only sort of over the last 300-400 years has become really an academic discipline. And I think what Mike you're talking about is just having a reflective view of the human condition and how to live well. And you don't need to be an academic philosopher or read, difficult tomes in order to do that. But I think thinking about it and reflecting on it in a way that maybe ancient philosophers, I think it would help screenwriting because it's going to get you deeper into the human condition.
And less reading is good.
Sophia?
Thank you so much, by the way. My question really is, what is your thought on the impact that believing in an afterlife or a higher power should have on ethics? And if it doesn't have an impact, where do you get the answer to, like, where is the inherent value in things like morality or justice?
This is an excellent question. So the question is about the afterlife and to what degree the afterlife should or does serve as almost like a North Star or something, right, for behavior, for ethical behavior. So the first thing I did when I had the idea for the show was I read a lot of books, not about philosophy, but about different religious conceptions of the afterlife, which are all fascinating and which I knew almost nothing about. And I got really excited by them. And I started thinking about the different ways that I could work them into the show, and then I remembered that it isn't a show about religion; it's a show about ethics, and that all of my work was pointless. I wasted a lot of time. But what was fascinating about it is to reflect on there's something so Like, I just got it for the first time in my life. I'm not a religious person. I wasn't raised with any particular religion. My dad technically is Jewish, but his family was so not Jewish that his name is Christopher, which is as un-Jewish as you can get. My mom was raised generally sort of Methodist, but they didn't really go to church. I have no religious background at all. And for the first time, I sort of got it, because in thinking about ethics and about the efforts to make people, or to lead people into making good choices or helpful choices or being better people, if you can say, hey, there's a reason for this, right? The reason for it is that if you do these things, you will be rewarded. And you won't just be rewarded with a gold star, you'll be rewarded with eternal happiness. That is such a good methodology for getting people to act well. It really is. Like, I really came to understand the inherent value of a system being able to promise something that they never had to follow through on, they could never be called on, right? No one could ever say, like, hey, you lied to me. It's impossible, because it only happens after you're gone. And they all had this sort of, they started to have this sort of beauty to me. In just as in form and function. Like, they really were beautiful. A lot of the actual conceptions of them were very beautiful and moving, and also their functions started to seem very beautiful. I don't have that. And so then the struggle became what played out on the show, which is, even though the show depicted an afterlife where you were either rewarded or punished, the message of the show was, you shouldn't do these things because they will be rewarded or punished. You should do them because what else are we going to do while we're here? Like, we have a certain amount of time on the planet, we have a certain number of actions we can take, a certain number of people whose lives we can affect in different ways, whether those are kids or spouses or partners or parents or friends, and you are constantly being asked to make decisions about how to treat those people. And the reason you should treat them well is because it's better than treating them worse. And I think that it's a little reductive, but I have come to, if you are a person with a religious background, and you do believe in an afterlife, and you do believe that your actions will be rewarded or punished, great. I have no problem with that. I think that's fine. And if that leads you to be a better sort of person, then whatever works is my attitude. If you don't have that sort of religious framework within which to work, I think that the answer becomes essentially just humanist. It just becomes, well, I have two options here. I can do something that will cause this person a little more happiness or a little more pain. Or you think I can do a thing I know is right, or I can do a thing I kind of know is wrong. Or you can think I can do a thing that is a little too much expressing this kind of bad characteristic, or I can try to aim more towards the middle. Like, all of these theories that I read are essentially saying, like, you have options when you choose to do things, and you can decide to some degree whether to do the ones that you think are the better options or the worst ones. And I think that that becomes its own sort of end. It really does. Like, that's where I end up landing with all of this stuff, is you do them because it's the right thing to do, and you don't think about the fact that there might not be some other purpose to that, some future reward or future punishment. You just do it because you're in that moment and this appears to be the right thing to do. And if it ends up being the wrong thing to do, then you do a different thing the next time. And that's how, this is as Todd explained to me many, many years ago now, another reason that I like Aristotle is because he's asking a different question than the other philosophers are. He's saying, what kind of person do you want to be? Not what should you do in this situation, but what kind of person do you want to be? And so I returned the shopping cart to the rack at the supermarket because I like myself more and want to be the kind of person who does things that I think are considerate instead of things that are slightly less considerate. If there is a hell or a heaven or any other religious conception of the afterlife, I don't think that I'm going there if I don't return the shopping cart to the rack, and that doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is I want to be a person who does things that are seen as considerate and that feel to me as though they are considerate, and so I do those things, and then that's the end of the situation. That's the end of the transaction. That's it. It's a self-contained moment where I have a decision to make, and I try to figure out what I think is the best version of that decision, and I do it, and then I move on to the next one. I don't know if I answered your question. I talked for a long time. I at least talked for a long time.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. First off.
Are you wearing a mouse rat t-shirt?
Yes, really big fan of the show. Like, basically what brought me and my best friend together. But I wanted to ask a question. So to me, Leslie Knope is a utilitarian. I mean, like, when she put the long poke artifacts on the lot to prevent the Paunch Burger from being opened, she thought that was for the common good. But who do you think is her philosophical foil in the show?
The question is, who is Leslie Knope's philosophical foil on Parks and Recreation? Well, the design of the show was that it was Ron Swanson, right? So that show, and I worked on that show, wrote that show before I had most of the philosophical understanding that I do now. So I'm a little bit retroactively ascribing things to characters who weren't built that way. But the design of the show was, that show was written in 2007, 2008. And what was happening at the time was the whole world was collapsing into like a puddle of investment banking nightmare misery sludge. And what was clear was that the government was going to be much more active in people's lives than it had been maybe in my lifetime. And so Greg Daniels and I were developing that show, and we were thinking like, this is an examination, investigation of how government can do good things and how they can do bad things. And in order to put that show on display and get to some kind of understanding of the forces of government, we decided to have Leslie was the protagonist, and she was, you would say, on the political spectrum, very progressive person, very convinced that the government can be a force for good, that the government should be allowed to do all sorts of things, should be well funded, and should be very active in people's lives. And we needed a foil for her, so we created Ron Swanson, who was a libertarian, like a 19th century libertarian. Shot his own meat, and and he at one point expresses a belief. He hates government so much that he doesn't believe there should be stop signs. Like that's how intense he was. We went around and did research, and we met with some government officials in local towns in California. And we said, at one point, we were meeting with this woman, and we said, we have this idea for a character. And the idea is that he's a libertarian who has like a fairly high position in the government, but he wants to literally tear the government down, like to its studs, and dismantle it. Is that too crazy? Is that too insane an idea? And the woman said, no, I'm a libertarian and I want to do that. And we kind of stared at her and she was like, I'm aware of the irony. So the idea of the show was that they were the extremes, but the reason that they worked together, and we did a whole episode about this in the last season, is because there were certain things, and I believe this is true at far ends of the political spectrum. If you are practicing what you preach, there are things that you have in common, and those things are things like integrity and honesty and a sense of honor about the way that you approach your job, and also a backbone. Like they both had a very strong backbone and would stand up for what they believed in, even if what they believed in was doomed to fail. And so the idea was that Ron, this 19th century libertarian, had met Leslie, a 21st century progressive, and had thought that every single idea that she expressed about the role of government was fundamentally wrong and absurd, but that he would rather work with her than with someone else for the simple reason that he identified in her certain, you would call them moral or ethical characteristics, that he also identified in himself, and that bond was what made them friends ultimately and made them work together well. So I would say he was her foil, but also we were at least trying to make what now may seem like a futile argument, that if even the staunchest libertarian and the most progressive were to sit in a room and have an honest conversation about that they could agree on certain basic things. It's basically Tim Scanlon's book, right? They could make arguments that the other one couldn't reasonably reject, and that's what would lead to some kind of mutual understanding or even professional success.
Woo!
That's happened. It hasn't happened yet. it's still hopeful.
Yes, white tank top?
When writing The Good Place, obviously you had to balance like ethical questions that you wanted to examine with plot and character directions. What kind of sacrifices did you have to make in either direction and how did you?
So the question was, in writing The Good Place, having to balance the ethical issues we wanted to discuss and then comedy and storytelling, how much do we have to sacrifice? The answer is a fair amount of each thing, and there were certainly moments where I felt like the philosophy in an episode would have benefited from another 45 seconds of explanation or discussion, but we were already kind of heavy on the philosophy and we just needed some plot or some jokes to kind of keep it lively. There were certainly times when I felt the opposite was true. A network TV show, the episodes are 21 minutes and 30 seconds long. It's not very long, and we were trying to balance all of those things. You know, tell a season-long story, a series-long story, character development, like A story, B story, sometimes a C story. And as a result, you end up losing some of the nuance that you would prefer that an episode had. It led to, I received it over the years, a number of unsolicited emails from academic philosophers who were nitpicking about the show and the way that things were presented. And I would always respond very politely and say, thank you so much, this is really interesting, and you know, blah, 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 blah. What I wanted to say was, hey man, how about you come to the writer's room? You think this is easy? But I didn't. Maybe did once. But generally speaking, I thought, we felt like the show was operating at its best when there was an equal amount of big idea, philosophical stuff, and also just comedy and plot and fun. This kind of stuff that people normally come to TV shows to experience.
At the back, in the cap. Yeah, you.
Sorry for the cap, I hit my head the other day. I wanted to ask, in terms of your philosophical interest, how did that translate into the character of Chidi, who is a professor of ethics and moral philosophy?
So Chidi was the first character, other than Eleanor and Michael, was the first character that I conceived of, and I conceived of him as a very, very strict Kantian, because, again, spoiler alert, sorry, the idea was that Eleanor is being tortured, unbeknownst to her. She's being tortured, and so the funniest possible person to pair up with a person like Eleanor is a strict Kantian, because Eleanor never gave a shit for 1 second about anything that she did. And so pairing her with a strict Kantian who is tortured with indecision about even the smallest decision that he has to make was ultimately, when the reveal happens that this is a torture chamber, that this is no exit, that was the funniest version. And I very quickly found that a Kantian is a very good comedy character. Sorry to all the Kantians in the room, but the rigidity of the mindset is excellent for comedy, because we could put him into a situation where he's being tested by the judge of the afterlife, and the test is, which of these two hats do you want? And he will spend an hour mulling over the differences without even having any information about why he's even doing this. So that he was the most, for much of the show, he was my favorite character to write. Because the other part of him is, I think that even if you're not a Kantian, if you've never heard of Kant, we all have probably met people who suffer from that kind of indecision in their lives, and we all have the feeling of frustration of making even the simplest plans with that person to go out, to go to a restaurant or something. So that was like an early, a thing I very early figured out about the show, is that we needed a Kantian and he was going to drive Eleanor crazy, and vice versa.
Yes, white t-shirt.
Yes, hi. I was just wondering, because a lot of, obviously, the whole purpose of The Good Place and, a lot of your ethical dilemmas, obviously some of them are very complex, in the, a trolley situation or something like that. However, I would say that the majority of ethics are rapid and straightforward. Do you punch your friend in the face for no reason? No, right? And so would you argue that there is a relative morality, or that there is a greater natural law that is in us as humanity?
It's very funny to drop that question with like 9 minutes left. Just real quick, are there natural laws or is morality relative? I think that the goal of the show was to send a message into the world, and the message was the questions of ethics surround us and fly around, buzz around our heads all the time. It doesn't particularly matter whether you choose to engage with them through philosophy. They're there, and the problem that I was trying to identify was people who simply ignore them completely. I think the only mistake that people can make, in my opinion, is to completely ignore them or to deny that they are there. And after that, we wanted to say, there are many levels on which you can engage with them, right? You can engage with them on the most simple, straightforward level of like, I'm gonna run this through my own moral compass for 15 seconds and then figure out what I think is the right thing to do. Or you can spend your entire life reading about and writing about theories of ethics and trying to like do what Derek Parfit did and write a 1,900-page book that tries to explain everything in one giant volume. But the right answer for everyone is somewhere between those two extremes. So I think the question is of like, is morality relative? That's the kind of question we tried to avoid. Because what we were honestly trying to do is just say, these questions are in front of you all the time, they confront us all the time, they're in every consumer decision you make, every personal decision you make. So just learn some stuff about what people have said about how we ought to behave, and then try to use that to the best of your ability. And that's really all we were interested in. We were less interested in coming to an answer about what the right thing to do is or what the right philosophy to follow is. We were just trying to throw all of this stuff into a big pit and say like, just here's a bunch of tools you can use in your lives, and the more of them you've used, the closer you might find you get to something approaching of an ethical life. I kind of dodged your question. We only have 6 minutes left.
Yes, with the mask, I think this might be the last question. We will see.
Thanks.
Oh God, you're reading this.
Months ago, and I took notes. One, this is secretly a two-part, but they're quick. Where did you land on why the Red Cross bunker plan was wrong? And two, do you still buy books from Amazon?
Two good questions. So I landed on, the way that I landed on it was wrong, wasn't one person. It was, I came to an understanding that no matter which philosophy I chose to look at the problem through, the philosopher in question would probably have a big problem with what I was doing. So Kant would say like, you've got to be kidding me, right? You can't get into a minor dispute with someone, grab something that's entirely unrelated to that dispute, drag it into the equation, and then use that as a club to bash his head in. That's not okay. We wouldn't allow that to be the way that we all behave, right? Aristotle would, I think, certainly say that I was expressing an excess of anger in my response. I felt an amount of anger towards him, and my fury, which drove the blog and the requests for money and everything else, was far out of whack with what he would consider to be a mean of mildness. The utilitarians, as I write about, may have given me an escape hatch, right? Because they would say, look, this guy maybe is going to be miserable and suffer a little bit in embarrassment and shame, but $25,000, that ain't nothing. Like, that's going to go to some very needy people. But, of course, any of you utilitarians out there, you can also see how they would say, like, if everyone now knows that this is possible in our society and that this kind of thing can happen every time we're in a minor dispute with someone, we are all going to be a little more bummed out about the world, and the combined sadness or dismay at my action would probably even drag down the utilitarian calculation into the negative column. So basically, I ended up feeling like I'm not sure exactly if I can pinpoint why this is wrong, but if you do something in your life and Kant and Mill and Aristotle would all be angry at you, you probably screwed up. Literally, like, on one side is you, and on the other side is every great philosopher who's ever lived. The chances are very good that you have blown it. And so it really wasn't one person, it was all of those people. And as far as the other question is, I try not to buy books from Amazon. I buy books from bookshop.org, which I've since learned from the independent bookstore community isn't great, but it seems to be better than Amazon. I do still use Amazon. I have 2 kids and they need stuff often very quickly, and the sad fact is that it's oftentimes the only way to get the thing that they need in the time amount that we get it. And also I will fully cop to a certain amount of laziness in my life where I can say, like, look, I could drive to that store over there and get this thing, or I can do this and have it delivered to my house. I still do that. I get annoyed at myself when I do it. I wish I did it a lot less than I do. But whenever I can, I try to avoid it. And there's no real excuse for it, but the only thing that mitigates it is that in the world we now live in, it is occasionally the only way to achieve the thing you need to achieve. And that, I guess you would say that the real problem is that there aren't other ways to get stuff in the time allotted.
But I should say that you did turn me on to bookshop.org. You should say, you buy your books from bookshop.org, don't you? Right?
Yes.
It just cost me some money.
Yeah, you gotta pay full freight with those folks. But also you're supporting independent bookstores. Do we want to support independent bookstores? Come on.
Yep.
That wasn't an applause. I wasn't asking for applause. That was rhetorical.
We need to let Mike get out to that all-important book sales and signing table. But this has been an absolute joy. Thank you so much.